Hey, good evening. Happy to see all of you here. Get everything up and rolling here. Hope that you've had a good day today and enjoyed all that has happened since we were last together in worship. And we're grateful for the opportunity to come together once again. I was jokingly telling, we have too many Jasons and Joshes here. Too many. I was jokingly telling Dobbs earlier that I want to be moved to Parker's group because I'm going to eat s'mores tonight. Now they had to swap. Parker's group, you're not allowed to crash our party. Okay, you can't come because y'all had to. Boy, appreciate what these men do. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into preparing this and planning this. Appreciate what they do and doing so and your response. I'm trying to figure out which slide we're supposed to be on. We're still in the Church of Philippi. Today's week 3 with Philippi. So we're going to begin on down a little further. Okay, slide 16 is where we're going to begin. The church, that doesn't matter to you. Aid in Corinth. So that's where we're going to begin our studies in Acts chapter 18. It'll be slide 16. So we've been looking at the church at Philippi on Sunday night, and we've been noticing a little bit of its background. We noticed taking the gospel to Philippi with Paul and his company. We noticed the conversion of Lydia and the ladies by the riverside, and we noticed the Philippian jailer. We talked about Paul moving on to Thessalonica. Lord willing, when we conclude our study of Philippi, we will then go into Thessalonica. I'll try to somewhat follow the pattern in the book of Acts with the churches now. But again, at any time that you have a congregation that we've not discussed that you would like to, please let me know. So we noticed them moving on, and we got into the book a little bit. We talked about how this is a book that Paul just really loved this congregation. These 4 chapters. In the New King James, he uses the word joy or rejoice 14 times. That's why it's important to remember the background, know a little bit of what's going on as well as the setting. Here's a prisoner writing about being joyful, writing about rejoicing. And we've talked a little bit about how this church aided Paul on his journeys as he was going on, as he was moving along. They were willing to send aid. And we talked a little last week as we were wrapping things up about, you can see a little bit about how they would have been able to do that, especially when Dr. Luke was a physician who wrote the book of Acts, when he tells us about Lydia's occupation and those of her household, those who would have worked with her, as well as this jailer. He probably, when you study a little bit of the history, he's probably doing okay financially. So you can see where the Lord would have blessed them with some money, even though this was a new congregation. So they could had it to go ahead and send along to Paul and to help him on his journeys. Now, one thing I mentioned this last week, and I try to emphasize this as often as I can, there is a difference in aid and in creating a support system. Okay, I won't necessarily go into all of that again tonight like we did last week. Maybe our study will go there, maybe our discussion will go there, but I'll not begin us there. But there's a difference in aid and a continual support system. Okay, the work of the church is to help to establish self-supporting congregations. That's within the realm of being able to stand on their own biblically, and having their own elders and their own servants in the church, but as well as financially. So we talked a little bit about how when Paul went on to Thessalonica, we read Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 20, that they sent aid to him. But now let's begin in Acts chapter 18, aid in Corinth. So, as you remember, the church at Philippi is established in chapter 16. He moves on to Thessalonica in chapter 17, and then to Berea in chapter 17. Eventually, he will make his way down to Corinth. Upon arriving in Corinth, Paul had to support himself. And there's nothing wrong with that either. It really bothers me in this day and time when we label preachers as if those who are supporting themselves financially outside of the church work, as if they're of a lesser preacher than those who are in full support ministry. And that's not the case at all. That's not the case at all. Some choose to do that way. Some have to do it that way. But that's not the case at all. They're all preaching the gospel just the same. So that's very important to remember. So, Acts chapter 18, beginning in verse 1, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. So this is where we learn that Paul was a tent maker, and remember Paul was educated. He was educated by some of the best, but as was custom then, and as is still today, the Jews would always teach their children a trade as well. And so Paul was a tent maker, the same as Aquila and Priscilla. So when he first arrives in Corinth, Bob, let's go back to our map if we can, just for a minute. I should have looked at this before. Yeah, okay, so you see Philippi, and I don't have the pointer with me, but the red arrow going to Philippi. And then he makes his way on around to Thessalonica, and then Berea, and then down to Athens. But now he's crossed over to Corinth. So this is where he is. He's in Corinth. And he's supporting himself. He's providing for himself. But we're going to see where the brethren from Macedonia, which would include Philippi in that area, are going to send aid to Paul while he's in Corinth. So that's what we're looking at. That's what we're looking at. If we want to go back now to the slide that we were on, slide 16. So he begins by supporting himself while in Corinth. But if you go to our next point, Timothy and Silas, back in chapter 17. I'm going to bounce around a little bit, but we need to know this to get us where we are. Acts chapter 17, verses 14 and 15, Timothy and Silas arrive from Macedonia to meet up with Paul. So then immediately the brethren sent Paul away to go to the sea, but both Silas and Timothy remained there. So those who conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed. So Paul would make that request for them to come. Jump back into Acts 18, and you get the verse 5. We already read the first 3 verses, so let's just read verses 4 and 5. Paul is in Corinth. He's met Aquila and Priscilla. They're tent makers. They're working. They're providing for themselves. Paul reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath. Verse 4, persuaded both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. So we see that Silas and Timothy make their way to Paul and while he is in Corinth. Paul would later recall financial assistance he received from the brethren in Macedonia when he was in Corinth. So then, the Macedonian support would not have been limited to the church at Philippi. It just says, go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 in verse 9. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 9. Remember, we did not read it last week, but we noted from 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 1 through 14 would be one of your texts that would teach that it is okay to support ministers from the church treasury. Okay, we discussed that a little bit last week, and certainly we would not want to be out of line with the scriptures there. So Paul talks a lot to the church at Corinth about finances, and he would tell them this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. You get to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, let's go ahead and read verse 8 first. I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied, And in everything I kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself. So Paul, to the church at Corinth, and we'll study the church at Corinth eventually. We'll get there as we make our way through the book of Acts and these congregations. But Paul has a little different approach with the church at Corinth than he does the church at Philippi. Paul had a great bond. We always talked about the church at Antioch, Antioch being one of, not one of, but kind of Paul's home base where his trips were based out of. He'd always go back there to report, and he'd always begin his journeys there. Well, Paul has a special connection with the church at Philippi. I mean, he just has a love for these people that you can see in this book. Unlike what you're reading in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it's a different approach. And I think we learn a little bit about that. There's sometimes it just, things don't always click. Even within the brotherhood, sometimes things don't. Now, that's not to say that we can't all be doing what God would have us to do. That's not to say that at all. But on our human side, there are those that we feel a little closer connection to than others, a little special connection to. And that's fine as long as we're not excluding anyone else or any congregation or anything like that. So that's important to remember. But Paul recalls receiving, while at Corinth, receiving help from Macedonia. And that, of course, was an area in which Philippi was located. So that's something that the bell called us last week. I was trying to finish that part up because next we're moving into a new thought. But I wanted to finish that at least to show the church at Philippi was a giving congregation, and they wanted to do what they could what the Lord had blessed them with. They wanted to bless others. And I think, individually, or with your family at least, you should pray that you'll give as the Lord has blessed you. Sometimes I'll ask God if I can do more, that He'll bless me with more, but if not, to keep it from me. But I think we should also pray for our congregation, especially our elders, and how they use what has been received on the Lord's Day. And because we discussed this a little last week. I don't know how many requests they get, but I know it's a lot. I know. I mean, that's just part of it. It's part of the work. And I think we should certainly pray for them and their wisdom, and the deacon groups who work with them closely in this, and how they move forward. And it's a lot to think about. Responsibilities here at home, responsibilities in this community, responsibilities all over the world. So I hope that we'll pray for our congregation here at Wood Avenue, and especially our elders as they make these decisions, looking out of how to use the Lord's money. I mean, it's a wonderful thing when Christians give. They realize they give to the Lord, but ultimately, Acts 11, 27 through 30, ultimately we're putting it in the hands of our elders to say, we trust you to do what God would have you to do with this. So, not to put too much pressure on you men tonight, but we appreciate that. We're trusting our souls to them. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 7 through 17. Ultimately to God, we realize that. But anyways, any thoughts or comments on the church at Philippi supporting Paul in this regards before we move on to another thought?
Thing that sometimes I suppose catches my attention today. Their mode of communication and whatnot was dramatically different than today. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have phones, period. And so when they were communicating needs and so on, it was days and weeks, I dare say maybe months that passed before they really knew what needs were, or before things arrived to Paul and others that were being supported. I mean, when they learned, well, first of all, they were keeping track of where he was, and that was by boat and whatever else. And so then it would be weeks before they knew about what the needs were, and then before they could get the things to get the aid to him would be weeks, perhaps at times.
Kevin mentioned, the difference then, today, how easy it is. Having phones, you can transfer your money just a moment's time to anywhere in the world. If you're not careful, somebody will transfer it for you. But, anywhere in the world it can be transferred. But then, of course, days and even weeks to know where someone is, to know what their needs are, and then to be able to get it to them, certainly. So that reminded me of 1 Corinthians. Again, we're not studying Corinthians, but it all ties together. 1 Corinthians 16, we look at these two verses quite often when it comes to giving. Later in the year, I'll probably teach a series of lessons on worship, where I'll look at the areas of worship, and if we include giving, do one a week for 5 weeks. But 1 Corinthians chapter 16, again, Paul would have a lot to say to the church of Corinth about giving. He says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up what he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. When I first started studying the Bible and really didn't know much about the Bible, I was misreading this verse, and I thought that was referring to when the Lord returns. That's why those 6 questions I always try to ask myself are very important. No, this is Paul saying, if I come, if I pass through and need help going on to the next place, have it there, have it ready. So there is that of having some ready, but at the same time, not being just a savings account where it's never used either. So that's important as well. But yeah, going back to Kevin's comment, that verse made me think of that verse of, it wasn't, I think, in my lifetime of the Lord blessing me with being able to travel overseas, it was very, very easy. It just compared to those who were doing it a half a century ago, it was very, very easy. I could easily at any time talk to Ashley back home face to face. That's nothing. There's nothing being overseas when you're able to do that. And so it's easy for people to take care of this day of time. Easier in some ways. Any other thoughts or comments before we move on?
And also, it's a bit interesting. An interesting question that came to me from this is just how much does it actually pay to be a tent maker? I can't find the answer myself so far, but I do know this, that the standard Roman soldier made about 225 denarii a year, which is equivalent to, if this math is correct, 339 USD a year. So if soldiers get paid that much, I'm truly curious how much tent making did, bring in.
Ridge raises the question of how much would a tent maker made compared it to a soldier who would have, how much they made. I don't know that answer off the top of my head. I've never really thought about that, actually. That's a really good question to think of. I'll try to research that a little bit on how much these tent makers would have made. If I can bounce off of that for just a minute, if you enjoy history, go back and read some of the works of our brotherhood here in the United States. It can be anywhere, but especially here in the United States. Some of them is as early as the early 1900s. If you're looking at the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, getting to the Great Depression and all that stuff. Not to mention those that would precede that, but again, it's not that long ago. And you read about some of these preachers who would take a train, all night to arrive the next morning and preach the gospel, and then, not make anything, maybe a sack of potatoes or something, and then take the train back. It's just amazing how things have changed, and that's where the church was grounded in this area by so many people. I heard Flavel Nichols himself say, and Flavel died probably in the last 5 or 6 years in his 90s, give you a reference, but when he was a young man, maybe even a teenager, he had a preaching appointment in a neighboring county, or a different county, he said. He would not tell us where. And he had just enough money to buy a train ticket to go, but not to come back. And his mom asked him, well, how are you going to get back? He said, well, I'm sure they'll pay me a little bit, and I'll use that to get back. Number one, he was willing to go preach for nothing more but to get back home. They didn't pay him a dime, and he walked home that night. He had to walk home all night, So that's a good point, Ridge, about how much tent makers would have made. And that's one thing that, again, that's what a lot of our brethren did. and going around and getting the church established in this area and other areas. Just some of the sacrifice that they were making. Some of them would preach for numerous congregations in one day. They would help to establish 2 or 3 congregations and preach for a few in one day. So we have a lot to live up to. This is true. Okay, moving along, what I call the Tim Tebow verse. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I like Tebow. I think he was a great athlete. But he always, of course, he had the I, whatever those things are called. And he'd have a Bible verse on his eyes. A lot of times it was Philippians 4:13. And you notice that this is a favorite verse among athletes. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Nothing, I suppose, is wrong with that. But it has nothing to do with sports. This verse is, God would be concerned that we conduct ourselves as Christians in whatever we do, wherever we are, at work, home, at school, sports field. He wants us to conduct ourselves as Christians everywhere we go. But this verse is, applied to the sports world so much that we as Christians need to look at what it really means for us. Here's a man who's a prisoner, writing about the joys of being in Christ, mentioning from time to time some of the hardship that he's dealing with. And he says, you know what? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So then, what if we in the church believed in this verse as much as the people in the sports world? What if we in the church believed in this verse as much and we applied it to the work that we do, what it really means and what I can accomplish in the Lord's church? And we said, you know what? This is going to be difficult, but I can do it. Whatever it is, whatever you're setting out to do in the Lord. So I realize it's going to have its ups and downs. I realize it's going to have its struggles, but you know what? I can do all things through the Lord who strengthens me. And in so many areas and in so many ways, this could be applied as well.
Whatever troubles come my way, I can make it through the strength of Christ. And that's really what he's saying here. He's not saying, I can lift a mountain with my bare hands because of the strength of Christ. No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying, I can, there's all these things that come through. I've given blessings, but I've also been given troubles. And regardless of any circumstance, I know that I'm going to make it through.
David makes a comment of, regardless of the circumstances, he knows he can make it through. He's been given blessings, is brought high, brought low. If you go back just 2 verses, I was looking at this as he was making that comment in verse 11. Now that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Wherever I am, I'm okay with it. If I have a little, that's fine. If I have a lot, that's fine. That was a mindset of Paul. And we talked about this a little already from the first chapter of Philippians. I think he was homesick for heaven. I think he said, hey, whatever happens, let it happen. And he was going with it. And he just looked at every day as a day to serve the Lord. It's very important to realize that.
I have a thought in my head that I've said before again to myself, is that I don't pray for free throws or red lights.
Free throws or red lights? Okay.
Basically, because free throws are something that I have to work on to get to. God, I'm not going to pop the ball into the basket. And then red lights are laid out. There's some things that are laid out. You just have to deal with what. Anyway, the thing about this Tebow verse is that it doesn't, if you read it in context, it has to do with perceiving spiritual things, the gospel, teaching righteousness. And just before it talks about what we're supposed to meditate on in verses 8. That we're supposed to think on things that are pure and true and good and just and lovely. And if we do those things, if we have that mindset of what we're thinking about and focusing on in our lives, then the strength and the power of Christ comes with that. Comes to us through, associating our mind and heart with the things of Christ. And so those are the things that, that are being projected here as far as the will of God. And it's not pretty gross and red line.
Kathy makes a comment, if you go back a few verses, verses 8 and 9, and you see what he's talking about here in the will of God. And she says something she thinks I've often praised, often not for free throws and red lights. I'm going to get you to explain that to me a little more later. Excuse me. I want you to explain that to me a little more later. But that's it. That's an interesting thought. Interesting thoughts. Interesting thoughts here on looking at what it means. And I believe the comment was also made of, what's that? Verse 8. Thinking on these things, and then whatever happens, you can have the strength to go through it, ultimately. If you're thinking on these things, meditating on these things, and going through it with that mindset. And again, that's Colossians 3, 1 through 4. Our mind needs to always be up. Our focus needs to always be upward, looking upward. And so that's very important to realize and understand that, when we're focused on heaven, it makes us less focused on the things that can happen to us here and what might can happen to us here as we go through our day-to-day.
Well, in all honesty, it's putting things in perspective. We as Christians, the main difference between us and the world apart from our salvation and the grace of God is that we have a perspective about eternity and where we fall, where this life falls in eternity and all of that. And in understanding, again, as it says here, whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's just, in some ways, at least in my view, that's talking about that perspective. We know what is true. We know what is, in all of that, not just here on things of this earth, but also we know what's true beyond this life to come.
Good point. On looking at that and what is true and what is honorable and what is respected, not only here, but knowing what is in the life to come. And I think, that's certainly what sets Christians aside from everyone else, because we're ultimately should always be looking at what is next, and that is heaven. That is heaven. And of course, that's what where we are different. Notice Philippians chapter 2, verses 25 through 30. The church at Philippi had Epaphroditus, a genuine servant of God. Philippians chapter 2, very likely the one who would have delivered this letter to Philippi. Verse 25 beginning. Yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, but your messenger and the one who ministered to my need, since he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick, almost unto death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I sent him the more eagerly, that when you see him again you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem. Because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me. So that kind of goes along with what we've been talking about in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13. And then you notice also Philippians chapter 4 and verse 18, as Paul is closing this letter out. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you. There goes that support, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. So the church at Philippi, and I think this is key, this is understanding, because our next point is they had elders and deacons. Let's go ahead and notice that, Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1. Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus. This isn't really in your notes, but it's a good verse to read. He was not writing to dead people. If you're a Christian, you're a saint. To all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with the bishops and deacons. Bishop's one of the titles for an elder. Bishop, elder, shepherd. So then, you see a congregation with elders, with bishops, with deacons, with people teaching them like Paul, like Luke, like others. But you see this man, Epaphroditus. And I think it's so very important as we study the Bible that we see these people that they're not, maybe we don't recall them as quickly as we would recall someone like a Paul or a Peter. They were very, very important to the church, especially to a local congregation where they worked and worshiped and served. Sometimes to multiple congregations, as could have been the case with Tychicus when we read about him in the letters to the Colossians and the Ephesians. So here's a man that we can see and learn a little bit about the church at Philippi. I mean, they were blessed to have this. Well, let's suppose it this way. Is this congregation blessed to have you in it? Certainly so, of course. But what are you doing your part to help this congregation? Ask it that way. Am I doing whatever my part is, am I doing what I can do to help this congregation? Because we see Paul mentioning the elders and the deacons in this group. Maybe he was one of them. I don't know. Maybe perhaps he was one of them. But what we do know is that he was a servant in the Lord. And again, it goes back to our study from Philippians chapter 4. He wasn't considering his life in this lifetime other than fully serving God. Other than giving it all to God. Giving it all to God. And that's important that we realize that and that we see that. And when we have that mindset, when we create that mindset in our members, and when others see that and do that, and we pass that down to the next generation, wonderful things happen for the local congregation. And that's important that we realize that as well. I want to make sure I mention this next part. So I'm going to move on, and I'll try to leave a couple of minutes there at the end. But the family must help one another. So if you have any thoughts on elders, well, I don't want to pass elders deacons yet. I'm sorry. Go to Acts 14. This might go into week 4, but that'll be okay too. Acts 14. He noticed the bishops and the deacons that were in Philippi. He noticed them. But Acts chapter 14 verse 23 is a very, very important verse to remember when we're talking about the elders or the bishops. Acts chapter 14 on Paul's first missionary journey, kind of a return trip. Is going back to the places where he already went and preached the gospel. And verse 23, so when they had appointed elders in every church. Okay, so that's a good verse to remember. Because they were going back to these congregations. When they had those who were qualified, 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, they were helping to appoint them as elders. I think when you look at the qualifications of an elder, that's what we should all be reaching toward. Okay? Not to say that all will serve as an elder. We know that ladies can. But yet those qualifications, those spiritual maturity are something that we should all be reaching toward in life. And we see that the church of Philippi were blessed with the elders, and they also had deacons. We see that it was for each local congregation, each individual congregation have their own elders and have their own elders within the congregation. I heard someone say once the greatest blessing to the local congregation is a strong qualified eldership. And I believe that. I really do believe that. I think that's the most important. I think having a strong qualified eldership is more important than having a preacher. I'm not asking you to fire me, but I think it is. I think that's where it's at. I think the deacons and the preachers work with the eldership, like all the members work with the eldership. But it's important to realize that, and not only for today, but also in always moving forward, always looking forward. It's a great, great blessing. Remember what Paul said to Titus just before giving the qualifications in the book of Titus? Set in order the things that are lacking, or something that was lacking prior to them having elders. And so that was very important. The church of Philippi was a blessed congregation to have these elders, to have those who had met the qualifications. Not only that they can lead the congregation in the right way, but the spiritual maturity of these group of men that others would see to have to be like that. And the spiritual maturity of the deacons. deacon qualifications are very similar to elder qualifications. There's a few differences, of course. But it says within this congregation you have multiple men that are maturing and mature enough in their Christian qualifications to be able to serve in these roles of elders and deacons. That's a great blessing to the congregation to see that, to see what it means, as well as, again, to the family unit. You have to consider what that is doing for these families when they have such within a congregation.
One thing, though, I think to be very careful of is I think the key word there is qualified. Because, and I probably discussed this with you as well, I've been in congregations up north where there are not men who are qualified. And I believe based on scripture, I think it would be far worse to have unqualified men be elders. Now, what the answer to that is in those congregations, I don't know, because, just the environment, stuff like that, it doesn't, unfortunately, a lot of times it doesn't lead well to having an eldership. I don't know if it's like a transfusion of elders from the South or, something like that. I don't know. I mean, like I say, it's kind of just one of those things where I know the problem, but I don't fully know the answer to solving that problem, other than I just know is that I've also seen some bad situations where unqualified men have served as elderships and it didn't end well.
Sure.
Matter of fact, usually the congregation ends up going down and becoming an unsound congregation. Well, they're not starting well that way.
Sure. The comment made is about qualifications and making sure they're qualified. Not just anyone can do it. The same qualification, this isn't necessarily an in-detail study of an eldership, but the same qualifications that qualify those to become elders disqualify everyone else. So that's important to realize. These set of qualifications that qualify those who become elders, it would disqualify all else. And David commented that the key in that is qualified. Yes, it is true. There are congregations that they just don't have men who are qualified. And so you cannot have an eldership if you do not have people who are qualified. You can still be a congregation that is serving God and always working toward that point of getting elders and having elders. I've served in both. I guarantee you I'd rather serve with an eldership for a number of reasons. One, to work together. One, you're not by yourself. Again, let me go back and apologize, RT. One, because sometimes when people ask you a question, you can say, I don't know, you have to go talk to our elders. There's some things it's not for me to decide. I'm not a pastor. I'm a preacher. I'm a minister. But no, we work together. We work together and discuss things together. So it is true, yeah. And there are congregations right here in Alabama who do not have qualified men. Here's my concern, if I can say it. There was a time it seemed as if congregations did not have elderships because men were not qualified because they were new. Seen a lot of this in the mission field. Congregations that's been started just in the last maybe 20 years or so, they're not yet mature enough. They're not yet gotten men to the point where they can be elders. So they're on the way up, so to speak. They're working towards that. What concerns me are congregations that have been around for close to a century, or maybe a century. And yet they don't have elders. Maybe they've had them in the past, but yet they don't have them today. And it might be that because they're choosing to be on a decline. And they're not preparing the future to have elders. They're not placing the importance of it, emphasizing the importance of it within the congregation and within the families. The greatest way to qualify men to be elders is to go home and talk to the mamas and the daddies. If we started with Jude today, we're 3 years too late. I mean, it's something that from a childhood you've known the scriptures, what Paul told Timothy. We're not necessarily just training him to be an elder, but we're training him to be the greatest servant he can be in the Lord's church. And if so, whether he serves as one or not, again, that list of qualifications that's spiritual maturity. So it's important that we seek this great work in this great role. With that being said, it's important that a congregation understands the need for qualified elders and to keep it going, keep that eldership going. In my experience, oftentimes once the eldership dissolves, it's very, very difficult to get it back. If you kind of get to that point and say, okay, we don't have to. We don't have elders. A lot of times it's very, very difficult to get it back. And that is and I'll say this, I think there are some who are content with saying, we don't have them, we don't need them. Well, see, now that's going against Titus chapter 1. We need them. We certainly need them. And that's important to realize as well. Let me mention this just quickly. Going on David's comment, there are 4 ways in which you can see the organization of a church. You're not going to find this in the Bible, but you can see this setup. You can see scripturally organized, scripturally unorganized, unscripturally organized, unscripturally unorganized. Scripturally organized is where you want to be. You're doing all things according to the Bible, and you're organized according to the Bible with your elders and your deacons, Philippians 1. Scripturally unorganized, you're still scriptural. You're still doing everything you're supposed to do according to the Bible, but you're not yet organized in the sense of we don't have people who are qualified. Okay, so you're okay in either one of those, but you want to be scripturally organized. Okay, unscripturally organized, well, you have your elders, but they're not qualified. You're not doing it according to Scripture. You're organized with your elders, but you're not according to the proper qualifications, whatever it might be. Unscripturally or unorganized, you're not doing anything according to the Bible, and you've come up with your one bishop over many congregations and other ways, so forth. Yes.
Just one adding to your point is, talking about raising kids, parents doing that too. Unfortunately, I think there's one other thing that we've kind of overlooked as a church, and that is that, a lot of congregations, I think we also need to look at when we have new converts, understand is that they could well, in the future, they could well be elders as well. Sometimes I think we convert people and kind of leave them there.
Sure.
And obviously, the Bible teaches against novice elders. That's not what I'm talking about. I would say it's like, look, let's train these people eventually, someday, in the future, where they would be qualified elders.
Sure, absolutely. Go to the next slide quickly, if you don't mind, just before we dismiss. We got time because we're staying and having fun tonight after services over in the annex, those who are staying. David made a comment of converting people. It doesn't have to just be our children that we're teaching, but in converting people, we can certainly teach them. I wanted to mention this because next week we'll continue our study of the book of Philippians. I hope that you'll key in on Philippians chapter 4 this week in your studies. We're going to notice these 2 ladies who had an issue in the church at Philippi. We're going to talk about that next week. And then the next verse, or the next slide, and then the next slide. Go on, one more. Sorry. One more. We'll get there. Okay. Christians in Caesar's household. So key in, next week we're going to study primarily from Ephesians 4, the beginning of the chapter, where a couple of Christian ladies who were servants, they have a little friction between them. And so we're going to discuss that. And then Christians in Caesar's household. There's a lot to be said about that. So we'll take this study into next week and look at that. Thank you so very much for being here. Thank you for your time. We look forward to seeing you again Wednesday night for our summer series at 7 o'clock with Cliff Goodwin. Thank you so much.